Over 800,000 people. Let me repeat that. Over 800,000 people are at risk of an impending massacre in Northern Darfur in Sudan, specifically El-Fasher. And to quote the Sudanese author and scholar Yasmin Abdelmajid, this is Hiroshima and Nagasaki levels. When the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is estimated that approximately anywhere between 110,000 to 200,000 something people were massacred. And if the RSF or the Rapid Support Forces right now were to begin their killing spree in El-Fasher, there is no telling how many people will be killed. And so we have with us here Professor Khalid Mustafa Medani, a Sudanese scholar, an associated professor of political science and Islamic studies at McGill University, and the chair of the African Studies and the director of Islamic Studies program at McGill University. Dr. Medani, welcome to Let's Just Talk. Please help us understand the gravity of what's happening on the ground in Sudan.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your show again. I think the gravity, you put it very well. I think sometimes people get lost in the numbers, by which I mean that in addition to 800,000 people under risk, there have been since the past year, over the last year, 8 or 9 million displaced. 60% facing food insecurity. I think that sometimes is not understood in terms of what it means, and that is it basically means people don't have access to food. It's not just a matter of food insecurity that they don't have nutritious food, they simply do not have food. And I think that it's very important to understand that. I think that your viewers and listeners should also understand not only the imminent tragedy in Darfur, but over the past year, there have been literally probably over 60,000 that have perished in Western Darfur, since the beginning of the war. In addition to that, we have over 1 million refugees outside of the country. And in addition to that, humanitarian kind of crises of this severity have to do with potential and human resources and infrastructure. The complete decimation and destruction of the infrastructure of the country, not only in Darfur, but elsewhere. Those of us who are Sudanese, of course, are extremely pained by the fact that there are no children going to school. And no possibility of that. Imagine a country of over 40 million people with children not being able to go to school. Health facilities decimated, over 70%. The only real kind of health access people have are volunteer institutions, such as the emergency response rooms. That is young people in Sudan doing everything they can with very little resources to try to keep people alive. And so when you put all of that together, not to mention, unfortunately, a series of war crimes associated with how these kind of wars occur, and that is not only extrajudicial killing, but a pattern of unbelievable sexual assault and rape. And so, that I think altogether really represents the severity of this conflict. As you know, the international community, including Doctors Without Borders and the United Nations, the humanitarian agency, have said that this is not only the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, it may be one of the worst in modern history. And I want people to let that sink in. And every time they hear about Sudan, to understand that this is a global kind of humanitarian crisis.
And let's go back. Did I hear you correctly that there's been like approximately 60,000 people killed in Western Darfur alone?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the war, as Darfur became the hotspot once again between the militias led by the Rapid Support Forces leader, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, fighting against not only the Sudan Armed Forces presence there, but also against communities that A, were trying to broker peace, and B, refused to join either party. Over the course of, I believe, 3 days, 40,000 people were killed.
40,000 in 3 days.
Yeah. This is in El Geneina. Particularly targeted were the Masalit ethnic group in Western Darfur. who had no recourse but to try to flee, those that could, try to flee across the border to Chad, an unbelievable decimation of a population in such a short amount of time.
So we hear things like from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, there's like, news of ethnic cleansing. But I'm astonished at why we're not hearing about this in the media, in the severity of it. Why we're not seeing images come out of Sudan. What's happening?
Well, there are two things. One of them, and I want to emphasize this because I think it's less intuitive, and that is the both sides to the conflict, the militants who head the armed forces, the Sudan armed forces, and the militia leaders that head the rapid support forces, have from the beginning targeted civil society activists, including those pro-democracy activists and resistance committees members, the youth that led the revolution in 2018 and 2019, but they have decimated and killed and targeted journalists. I'm not just talking about foreign journalists, I'm talking about Sudanese journalists.
Right.
And so there was from the beginning a premeditated understanding and strategy against exposing the war crimes that are ongoing. That's at a level that I think people really have to understand because it really speaks to the kind of violence that we are witnessing in Sudan and throughout the country. The other part, of course, is the way that African conflicts have been normalized as part and parcel of African kind of politics and society, which is, of course, not true. The majority of Africans are not at war with each other. Very few countries have this kind of civil wars or wars ongoing. Another is issues, I believe, of racism that, over time, I think there's a long history of perhaps African lives not really having the same kind of standards or attention, deserving of attention. Now, that is rarely said outright, but I think we have a clear record, and we don't have to go into it because of the shortness of time in terms of how Black bodies are experienced and understood. And that is something that is part and parcel of what Africans have said a long time, that Africa is somehow this barbaric space out there where it is characterized almost exclusively by killings, by war, and by the lack of value given to human life. That, of course, is not something unique to African populations. It occurs throughout the post-colonial kind of countries in the global South in particular. But that's something to be taken seriously because journalists have to understand that they're trained to cover other conflicts such as Ukraine and even formerly in Bosnia and Herzegovina in ways that they are not trained or to cover. Many African and Black journalists who worked with, I think some of them, who worked with international media outlets have resigned. I include myself. I used to be a producer for NBC News, and I resigned before doing my PhD because of the lack of attention and dehumanization given to the coverage of Africa.
Right. And I have so much to say on that. I'm just gonna 30 seconds. Even there is this school of thought, I'm not sure, maybe it's Afro-pessimism, about like Black bodies, we have a slave relationship with the rest of the globe, where it's like our death, our trauma, our tragedies do not warrant global attention, do not warrant outcry. Yet, they always want to scapegoat other issues, like, oh, this is like, as in saying like Ukraine is happening. But it's like, no, like that's a different kind of conflict than what's happening in the Sudan or Palestine. And it's like, no, Sudan was happening 6 months before that. Or Congo is like, no, you haven't been talking about that either. And so it's like, it's an issue with the globe rather than scapegoating other people's tragedies and massacres. It's like they all deserve to be covered. And this notion of like when it's white bodies, we know the stories, we know the names, we know, the hopes, the dreams. When it's Black bodies, like, oh, 60,000 people, 40,000 killed in 3 days. It's just numbers. Like the numbers go over your head until you contextualize it. But anyways, moving from that, a humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations have called El-Fasher a kill box, meaning there is nowhere for civilians to escape, right? And the United Nations Security Council have put out a statement, called on the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF to de-escalate and stop the fighting and the impending massacre that's going to occur in El-Fasher if the RSF proceeds out there. And they've also called on countries of influence to hold back their dogs, call back the people that's funding them, i.e. the United Arab Emirates, who has been funding and supporting the rapid support forces. Can you speak to that a little bit? And what role international organizations or people in the diaspora can play in this specific time?
Well, let me begin with the people in the diaspora because I think it speaks to the previous kind of discussion that you were kind of highlighting, and that is the younger generation understand, not all of them, of course, but we do see some kind of sea change in terms of the younger generation, not only across college campuses, but across other groups of and sections of civil society, understanding the long history of racism and neglect of, let's say, African conflicts, or not, not, you know, uh, understanding that these conflicts are leading to grave humanitarian deaths and crises. And so there is increasing effort to link all of these together. And I think that that's really important. And the diaspora is doing that. The activists in the diaspora, even local journalists and activists on campuses are trying very hard. It's at the beginning stage, but they're
Right.
trying to very hard to ask the question of what do these conflicts have in common?
And
How
how
can
are
we
our
unite?
struggles, like how are our struggles interconnected? Because everywhere you look is the same foreign or external actors have their hands in the same places in our misery. But please.
Absolutely. And the first order of business is to have concrete analysis because it's not easy, it's not intuitive to link all of these disparate conflicts and understand that they have commonalities. And in so doing, of course, they have some kind of similarities in terms of resolving these conflicts too, in the larger sense. And I think a diaspora activist and others are really kind of beginning that long but very important analytical journey. So I think that's important. But to speak to El-Fasher itself, I have been there many times. It's very different from other parts of Darfur. It is very remote. It is arid rather than semi-arid, by which I mean it's very difficult to actually travel across the region. And so people are essentially kind of located in villages. And so the population there now, 800,000, as you noted, are essentially under siege and encircled by two opposing forces intent on exterminating the other party. That, of course, is the forces of Sudan Armed Forces, the military that are now supported and led by the members of the former Islamist movement in Sudan and the Bashir regime of the past. And they're basically bombing villages because they don't have troops on the ground. That is the only way that they can achieve this. Ironically, by the way, in the past, they had used militias in order to implement scorched earth policies to achieve their military objectives. Now that they're at war with the same militia that they used in the early 2000s to kill Darfurians and to achieve military victory, you have a graver crisis because you have two opposing forces of equal power, although utilizing different strategies. On the other side, their population, the civilian population, is caught in the crossfire of the militias themselves that are using scorched earth policies and that kind of violence against civilians in order to achieve a military victory. I think it's very important for people to understand that, unfortunately, this is not just about ethnic hatred. It is first and foremost about a military strategy that does not mitigate or underestimate the level of violence, but we have to understand the military and political logic associated with this kind of siege and this kind of violence. Politics is important, and that's where you begin to see linkages with other external actors, without which we cannot understand their interventions and their support on the part of the United Arab Emirates, of course. It is not only allowing and supporting and in many ways, in many instances, transporting arms, but also finance. It also is part of a larger strategy of supporting Haftar, the militia leader in Libya, and their own economic interest in other parts of the Sahel and Africa. Understanding the political logic of external actors is crucial. In the case of, let's say, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, concerned about the Islamist resurgence in Khartoum, but also very much favoring and supporting the Sudan armed forces for their own interest. That, of course, is part of the political logic of geostrategic interest of these countries in Sudan. Sudan then is burdened by two intertwined dilemmas. One of them, of course, are these two generals intent on, kind of an outright military victory. But the Sudanese population is burdened also by external actors interested in one of the most strategic and wealthy countries in the world. And here is where the diaspora and the global community must understand. It's not about not reporting on Sudan. It's not about that Sudan is so-called forgotten. It's that Sudan is central to the geopolitics of the region and the world. Sudan is the 12th largest exporter of gold, the third largest in Africa. Gold is crucial not only to the markets in Dubai, but as far afield as Russia. The strategic Red Sea region that is at the hotbed of the current conflict associated with the war in Gaza is right there on the borders of Sudan to the east. Sudan is not peripheral. Sudan is central to all of these global conflicts. So we're not asking people to look at Sudan and feel sorry, although that's important for all of the hundreds of thousands that are perishing and under threat. We're asking them to understand that they have a strategic and direct role in the conflict in Sudan, because all of these countries that are intervening in the Sudan war are linked directly to Washington, D.C. They're linked to the capitals of the Gulf. They're linked to Moscow. They're linked to Iran. They're linked to all of the so-called superpowers internationally and regionally. So what I'm saying, and I think that you understand, you're nodding your head, is once we understand the grand politics of the war in Sudan, the global politics of the war in Sudan, young people in the diaspora and elsewhere throughout Europe, the West, and the global South understand fully that this is our war too.
Yes, and I think the thing that gets me depressed, however, Dr. Medani, is we are relying on the goodness of institutions that have no incentive for a peaceful, democratic Sudan, but gain everything from a destabilized Sudan. And so, how do we move from there? And then to wrap us to begin wrapping us up, what's in terms of El-Fasher, what's next? What can we do? Because Yasmin Abdelmajid, and I encourage everybody watching this to go follow her because she has a multitude of resources on her page. She tells us to bring awareness to it. She tells us to, you know, do anything you can. Email your political representatives, your foreign ministers, all the above. But like, is there anything else concrete that you can tell us in terms of staying informed about what's happening and contributing to a prosperous Sudan?
Well, what I can say is partly what you said. Follow the people like Yasmin Abdel Majid on Twitter, Khulud Khair, so many important, Nisreen Al-Amin, so many important scholars who are Sudanese and journalists and activists who are putting the word out there. You can also read a special issue on Sudan that we did with Middle East Report. I have a piece in there, and you'll have a number of young people, activists, and NGOs giving you the kind of both the political context and the humanitarian context. And so the information is available, circulated. All of this, all of these issues online. All of us are doing it to get the word out there. I think that that's extremely important to understand, and link up with other conflicts as well. As you're interested in another conflict and to try to alleviate the humanitarian and human suffering in other contexts, include Sudan there and start making these linkages, as so many young people on campuses, including today, a friend sent me something from Princeton University that was linking Palestine and Congo and Sudan together right there in the encampment. That is powerful. symbolically and realistically, analytically, when you have young college students who are the future, not only of, Africa, but certainly, of course, throughout the world and the United States, that becomes important. In terms of what I see for El-Fasher, and this is something that I feel is important, but not necessarily non-controversial. I do believe in the push and lobbying for a UN peacekeeping force. Now, that is up to debate, and the Sudanese have different views of it. But the first and foremost, it's interesting coming from political scientists, but as you know, I'm also from Sudan. And so my priority is to save people's lives, not only my country, but a region of my country that I spent so many wonderful times in. And I have many friends in the Darfur region, including El-Fasher, where I spent, and Kabkabiya, the smaller villages in that part of Sudan. And so my priority is to stop the killing. And I believe that international concerted effort, now that there is attention and understanding of reconstituting the African peacekeeping force that was established in 2007, but then disbanded in 2020 because both of these generals forced it out of Sudan, is really important. That is the number one step. The United Nations must take this seriously. They did not take it seriously in the case of Rwanda, for example. But here, no, we have to push for that. Least, at least because it puts pressure on these warring parties. Following that, of course, there has to be an international pressure of a ceasefire. I have to be very practical in this, and there must be a concerted effort on the part of countries in the international community to really understand that they're not only part of the problem, but can be part of the solution, by which I mean that they have to really have a coherent plan for a ceasefire, and they have to understand that they have to coordinate because their own interest in the long term is completely being undermined. That's really key. In the longer term, and this is to conclude with respect to the democracy, if you read my piece in Middle East Report, you'll see that I believe it is entitled The Enduring Legacy of the Revolution in Sudan. And that enduring legacy is democracy and the will of the Sudanese people. I don't say that theoretically, I say that practically, because the people in Sudan that are doing all the work to make to give a chance for the population to survive are the same people who led the revolution in 2018 and 2019. They're the ones who continue to organize the resistance committees. They're the ones who continue to link up with the diaspora to support the voluntary emergency response rooms that are keeping people alive to the extent that they can. They have a blueprint for transition to a civilian government and democracy. And these generals, of course, are trying everything in their power to make people like you and others throughout the world to forget about that revolution. Only today and yesterday, they were arresting, I know there's attention to Darfur, rightly so, they were arresting activists, resistance committee activists in the eastern part of Sudan. And that is because they want that history to be extinguished. We can't allow that to happen. What we can do is to support civil society organizations. And let me conclude, as I always do with Darfur. Number one, this is not a conflict of immutable inter-ethnic hatred. I was there, and I'll tell you why that's important. El-Fasher has an organization, a number of networks called the Elders and Mediation Committee. And I think, as you know, as an African, you'll understand how elders are important in resolving conflict. That committee in El-Fasher, prior to the siege, and this is a reason why the siege has occurred in the way it has, outlined what you're asking me. They outlined the framing of the conflict as a war between two generals and not between Sudanese or Darfurians. They outlined a blueprint for a ceasefire, and that they outlined a blueprint of how community leaders and individuals can actually implement that ceasefire by monitoring it through intercommunal cooperation. I don't want to leave this interview by not highlighting that the solution for Sudan is going to be led by Sudanese. They're the largest and most important and primary stakeholders. And this model that I just told you about is familiar to Africans elsewhere. And that is Sudanese and Darfurians at the community levels who are telling the world, this is how we see the end of this conflict. This is how we see intercommunal collaboration, cooperation, and rebuilding trust. Not highlighting that, obscuring it by kind of generalizing the conflict as one that has little to do with the central problem of Sudan, its economic and political history and external interventions and actors, does a disservice to the same people that people are purportedly trying to save. So let's take seriously what Darfurians and Sudanese are saying, how they feel, and they know this conflict can be stopped, and how peace can be restored. And that I want to emphasize that, to leave you always with this important, hopeful, and I believe workable future for Sudan, which is going to be so important for the region.
Dr. Medani, as always, you're incredible. Thank you so much for your insights, and we look forward to continuing these conversations with you.
Thank you so much for your attention to Sudan. You're always there, and I want all Pan-Africanists to understand that the revitalization of Pan-Africanism is always about positive developments, but it's also about securing the well-being of Africans at the present moment.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.